Welcome to GLOBEWATCH with me, Charles Ebune. It promised to be an entire continental affair, but it turned out to be just for a majority. 44 African countries decided to sign the Continental Free Trade Area, which has taken years for the continent to come to such a conclusion after several negotiations. Of what value will this be to the development of Africa, especially in the commercial and business sectors? My guest today on GLOBEWATCH is the Central Africa Regional Director for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, one of the partners of the African Union, which led to the conclusion of the Kigali Agreement under the auspices of the current chair of the Organization of the African Union, the Rwandan President Paul Kagame. Antonio Pedro, welcome to GLOBEWATCH.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to speak to you, Charles.
44 African countries meet in the Rwandan capital, Kigali, and pen their signature to the continent's wide-ranging continental trade area. What is it all about to an ordinary businessman in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt?
Well, first of all, I think let's celebrate, because the Continental Free Trade Area is the culmination of the aspirations of African countries to create an economic community as expressed in the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action and in the Abuja Treaty of 1991, which was meant to establish the African Economic Community. So with the African Continental Free Trade Area, we will be providing access to a market of 1.2 billion people, to a trader in Sharm el-Sheikh or in Cape Town who has products to sell that meet the consumer needs and requirements of our citizens. So it's about reducing tariffs. So we'll be reducing 90% of tariffs from the existing set of trade regimes. 10% of it will be still subject to tariffs on what's the so-called sensitive products. So we expect that with the introduction of the Continental Free Trade Area, the volumes of trade as compared to the 2010 figures will increase by 52% just by removing the tariffs, and double that if we address the non-tariff barriers.
This has been a very long process in which so many organizations, government and civil societies were involved to see it come to reality. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, of course, has been producing reports and supporting such systems. Just how were negotiations done to arrive at such a conclusion?
Yeah, we at ECA, we are very, very happy of this development. After all, Professor Adedeji Adebayo, who used to be our executive secretary, he was the architect of the Abuja Treaty and of the Lagos Plan of Action. So, and as we celebrate our 60th anniversary, it's really, really, really very important for us to see these developments. So the negotiations to arrive at the Continental Free Trade Area took quite a lot of time. We can even move back to a couple of years to when the SADC, the COMESA, and the Economic Community of East Africa together have decided to create the tripartite free trade area, which at that stage would have created a market of about 600 million people. And that moved the rest of the continent to decide to instead, or at the same time, pursue the establishment of the Continental Free Trade Area. So it has been a very long process, and it required negotiations involving ministers of trade across the continent. And under the leadership of His Excellency, the President of Niger, we've culminated these efforts with the signature of the draft agreement. So it was a long process.
It was a long process, and during the signing in Rwanda, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Vera Songwe, hailed the initiative and urged African governments that this is a positive move which needs legislative approval now. Why does the Economic Commission for Africa see this as a giant step? What will be the financial value addition to the continental market?
With the opportunities that this larger market will create, African countries will be able to promote structural transformation of their respective economies through industrialization. And industrialization will reduce the exposure of our countries to the perils of the variations of commodity prices, the macroeconomic instabilities that many countries in the sub-region have been affected with because of their dependence on the export of non-processed commodities. So this is the opportunity that the establishment of the Continental Free Trade Area provides. The volumes of intra-African trade will increase when these barriers will be removed. Currently, the figures vary, but let's say we're all talking of about 16% or so. This will increase to 32% by removing the tariffs, and to 64% if we also address the non-tariff barriers. With non-tariff barriers, I'm talking about the roadblocks that we are facing in intra-African trade. I'm talking about the infrastructure bottlenecks that make trading very, very difficult, the cost of trading being very, very difficult. It takes 4 times more time to transport containers in Africa than in other parts of the world. That makes it expensive. So we need to address those infrastructure bottlenecks. We need to establish one-stop borders that will facilitate trade.
You just mentioned infrastructural difficulties that will probably impede the process. We will talk that in a moment. You equally mentioned the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Plan of Action, which was like the core documents for what we had in Rwanda, but you realized that having a continental free trade area without the continent's largest market, Nigeria, did not sign to it alongside 8 other African countries. Simply a useless exercise, right?
No. I mean, this reflects the reality. As we've indicated earlier, this process took a long time because we need to address real concerns of our member states about the beneficial or the negative impacts of liberalizing trade. So there are countries on the continent that still believe that by opening their borders to free trade, they may suffer the impacts of dumping that producers from neighboring countries can dump their products in their respective markets, thus rendering uncompetitive their own production. So it's a little bit of that fear. And also, it's a little bit a reflection of the pressure that those governments suffer from their own entrepreneurs, their own industrialists. So for us to be successful in these kinds of exercises, one requires the necessary patience and tact to engage constructively with all of the member states concerned with a view to addressing their real concerns.
Do you think that the arguments provided by the Nigerian federal government not to sign for the amendment economically sound when we know that Nigerian businessmen are those who are implanted in nearly all the 54 African countries? If you take the Tony Elumelu entrepreneurship program, which covers all the countries, if you take Aliko Dangote, if you take Fularo Show, who deals in the oil and gas sector, do you think that the government was not supported by the Nigerian business class, which is pro-continental?
Well, I don't have the facts. What I'm certain of is that sooner rather than later, I'm sure Nigeria will be part and parcel of the African Continental Free Trade Area. After all, the Lagos Plan of Action was born in Nigeria. Professor Adedeche is Nigerian, and many other leaders from Nigeria, including businessmen, are benefiting, as you've indicated earlier, from opportunities of trading across the continent. So this is a real concern, as I've indicated, but I'm sure that within the country there are all the necessary efforts being made to measure the costs and benefits of the Continental Free Trade Area and address what the country needs to do with a view to maximizing the opportunities that it creates. So it is a process. The same way that the Continental Free Trade Area will not become a reality immediately. As you know, member states are required to ratify this agreement through their national policy processes. In some countries, this will require submission of the agreement to their respective parliaments. And only after 22 countries would have ratified the agreement, then the African Continental Free Trade Area will become effective. So let's give time to all of those processes to take their necessary course, and I'm sure more countries will sign. What is good news is that Central Africa has done exemplarily. Out of the 11 countries that are member states of the Economic Commission of Central African States, 10 have signed it. This is a very, very, very important effort and development on the continent, in Central Africa.
Apart from the legislative bottlenecks and bureaucracies we are going to see, a while ago you spoke about the infrastructural challenge. How do we ensure free trade in the continents where we know that the road network is not the best, that the telecommunications connections are very poor, that internet connection between countries is somehow morose?
Well, the sister instrument to the African Continental Free Trade Area is the Boosting Intra-African Trade, the BIAT, which, among other things, have a series, there's a plan of action that includes the need to address those infrastructure bottlenecks, the need to scale the level of transport and trade facilitation. In the context of Central Africa, we are talking about accelerating the implementation of the Central Africa Transport Conceptual Master Plan. So this is very, very, very important. And the good news is that already the authorities in Central Africa have taken that thing as part of their priorities. There will be a revitalization effort towards ensuring that the Continental Free Trade Area becomes, the Transport Master Plan is operationalized, that the missing links are addressed, that the capitals are linked, that we increase the business fundamentals of some of these transport corridors by linking them with the centers of growth, of higher growth potential. The African Development Bank has established the AfCFTA Fund as a means to, as a seed investment towards addressing the huge financial investments that are required to address Africa's infrastructure needs. We are talking about $100 billion a year. So this is a significant amount of money that a lot of stakeholders have to come on board with a view to addressing that shortcoming. It will require very solid public-private partnerships in the view to mobilizing funding. We will have to also have other innovative funding instruments. For example, capturing the savings of our pension funds, our diaspora, whose resources are currently being invested mostly for consumption products.
Some ordinary business people across the continent and ordinary citizens think that when you talk of a continental free trade area, to their understanding, they mean to say that no CEMAC will exist, no SADC will exist, no ECOWAS will exist, no Maghrebian Union will exist. Are they correct to reason in such a way?
Well, 80% of the economic activity on the continent is done by small and medium enterprises, and 70% of trans-border trade is done by women. This is a constituency that will benefit significantly from the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, because currently they face those non-tariff barriers. They are harassed by all sorts of people across the borders, and women are subject to violence and so on and so forth. By establishing free trade area, those movements will become, hopefully,
will those trade blocks disappear?
That's exactly the ultimate objective, that we'll have one single continental free trade area.
One single and large market. We will be coming to an end very shortly. There are so many currencies on the continent. There are so many security challenges on the continent. What kind of mechanisms should governments introduce? Because some are not opening their borders because of porous security, trans-border areas, whether a currency will be harmonized and all of that. All those issues need to be worked out with time. What is going on behind the scenes?
Well, as you know, the Abuja Treaty is centered on the recognition of the regional economic communities as building blocks. And at the level of these regional economic communities, there are already efforts with a view to establishing common currencies. Already, in our Central Africa sub-region, CEMAC represents a monetary union. The CFTA is a reality. And through the steering committee towards the rationalization and harmonization between CEMAC and ECAS, we will see progressively all the 11 countries in Central Africa adopting one single currency. In West Africa, as you know, we are facing more or less the similar situation here. We have the UMOA countries that have single currency, the CFTA, and then we have a couple of Anglophone-speaking countries, including Nigeria, Ghana, etc., that have their own national currencies. There's an effort there already to try and have what they call the ECO, which is going to be a single currency for the entire West Africa. I see the scenario where progressively across all of those building blocks, you will have single currencies. And then ultimately and hopefully, Africa will have one single currency. But this is a process that requires tact, it requires dialogue. Otherwise, we will be facing the same problem that the European Union has faced with Brexit and so on and so forth. So regional integration requires that capacity to understand the concern of different stakeholders and create the necessary platforms for their views and expectations to be heard and be mainstreamed in defining the final outcome of regional integration architecture. Already, we have quite a majority of African countries, 44 of our member states, that have already signed the Continental Free Trade Area. 50 of them have signed the Kigali Declaration, committing themselves to mainstreaming the African Continental Free Trade Area. 27 of them signed the African Union Protocol on the free movement of people. This is significant.
In about 15 years from now, the continent will have 450 million young people. When you talk of the Continental Free Trade Area, does it augur more jobs creation for them? And how will the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa be assisting finally in the entire implementation process?
Yeah. The African Continental Free Trade Area is predicated on moving from economies that are essentially based on the production of commodities, unprocessed commodities, to an economy where the secondary and the tertiary sectors are, have a higher percentage shares of total production. So we are talking of structural transformation. And as manufacturing increases, or the share of manufacture increases, the number of jobs increase. So already by creating this Continental Free Trade Area, the opportunities to increase the share of manufacturers in total production will increase, and that can generate more jobs. Second, that will also create opportunities for young and innovative entrepreneurs to explore these opportunities. So we need to change the mindset so that through our education systems, so that young people on the continent, they become also the creators of their own job. And this is part of the paradigm shifts that are required. The opportunities are there. By 2050, we will have more than 2 billion people. By 2025, the economy will be $3.6 trillion, the GDP. That's a lot of opportunity for young people to become part and parcel of the solutions for job creation, on creating dynamic, strong, and resilient economies across the continent.
Antonio Pedro, thank you very much indeed for being guest on GlobeWatch.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you.